My life was on a straightforward path, marked by military training and the pursuit of a disciplined future. Then, in an instant, everything I knew about existence was shattered. I found myself looking down, calmly observing my own body as a team of strangers fought to bring me back from the brink. What if the most profound moments of our lives happen when we're no longer truly alive?
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a truly unique and profound journey. Before we dive into Gregory's incredible story, which takes us from military training to an out-of-body observation of his own resuscitation, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like this video. And for today's general question, just to connect, what's one small thing that made you smile today? Share it in the comments below. All right, no more delays. Let's get right into Gregory's experience.
Life before that moment was a carefully constructed path, a blueprint I was diligently following. I was a young man, fresh out of high school, ready to embrace the disciplined world of military training. Before October 1980, my life was a symphony of predictable routines and unwavering ambitions. I was Gregory, a name that felt as ordinary as the suburban streets I grew up on. My days revolved around the structured demands of an ROTC cadet, a future in the U.S. Army laid out before me like a neatly folded map. Just weeks after tossing my graduation cap into the air, I found myself immersed in the intense crucible of U.S. Army ROTC basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky. The summer sun beat down on us, a relentless drill sergeant for our nascent military aspirations. Every morning began with the shrill whistle of reveille, followed by the rhythmic thud of combat boots on dusty parade grounds. My world was defined by push-ups, marching drills, and the camaraderie of exhausted recruits. I was, by nature, a pragmatic and somewhat stoic individual. Emotions were not something I readily displayed, preferring to navigate life with a logical, straightforward approach. My interests were grounded in tangibles, the mechanics of how things worked, the satisfaction of a physical challenge, the clear-cut objectives of military training. There was a quiet determination that fueled me, a drive to excel, to prove myself capable. While not outwardly boisterous, I found a subtle joy in the small victories, mastering a new drill, hitting a target at the firing range, or simply pushing through another grueling physical test. My routine was a comfort, a predictable rhythm that promised control and progress. Looking back, a few key memories punctuate that pre-experienced landscape. I recall the vast, open fields behind my childhood home, where I'd spend hours dismantling old electronics, fascinated by the intricate circuitry within. There was a quiet satisfaction in understanding how each component contributed to the whole, a nascent curiosity about hidden structures. Another memory flickers to life, a particularly brutal cross-country run in high school, where my lungs burned and my legs screamed, but a stubborn refusal to quit propelled me forward. It wasn't about winning, but about pushing past perceived limits. These were moments that solidified my belief in effort, in the idea that persistence, no matter how painful, would always yield results. Yet beneath the surface of this disciplined existence, there was an unspoken, almost imperceptible sense of something missing. A quiet hum of unfulfilled curiosity about the deeper currents of life. Emotionally, my pre-near-death experience state was one of quiet competence, perhaps bordering on emotional detachment. I wasn't prone to dramatic highs or lows. There was a steady undercurrent of anticipation for the future, a subtle hum of excitement for the challenges that lay ahead in my military career. Boredom was a foreign concept, as I was constantly seeking to better myself or master a new skill. However, looking back, I realized there was a subtle emotional suppression, a tendency to compartmentalize feelings rather than fully experience them. I was focused on the external, on achievement and physical endurance, rarely delving into the intricacies of my own inner landscape. When it came to life and death, my views were, to put it mildly, conventional and largely unexplored. I was a lapsed Roman Catholic, baptized and having attended services sporadically, But faith wasn't an active cornerstone of my daily life. Death was an abstract concept, something that happened to others, a distant inevitability with no immediate bearing on my youthful vigor. I believed in the scientific explanation of existence, in what could be seen, touched, and measured. The notion of a soul or an afterlife was a quaint religious concept, not something I spent much time contemplating. My skepticism was a quiet, unstated assumption, a pragmatic lens through which I viewed the world. The idea of a transition, of consciousness beyond the physical body, was simply not part of my reality. It was this steadfast, almost unshakable perspective that was about to be profoundly, irrevocably challenged.
I was wheeled in for an X-ray. The technician's eyes grave as he noted both lungs involved, a lattice of faint lines stretching across the film. Even then, I remember thinking, how could something so visually ominous feel so normal? Just before everything changed. The morning of October 1, 1980, dawned with the usual muted gray light filtering through the institutional windows of the infirmary. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about it. The air hung heavy with the faint, sterile scent of antiseptic and something vaguely metallic, the lingering essence of illness. My body ached, a deep, pervasive weariness that had become my constant companion since the bout of pneumonia I'd contracted during basic training. I was back in a military setting, this time at the school's small hospital, a modest facility with perhaps 15 beds. My current struggle was a severe case of diarrhea and dehydration, a relentless drain on my already depleted reserves. The rhythmic drip of the IV in my arm was the only consistent sound, a small metallic echo in the otherwise quiet room. I remember the nurse's soft footsteps in the hallway, the distant clatter of a food cart, the mundane symphony of a place designed to heal, not to house a nascent crisis. My journey to this point had been a winding path of deteriorating health. The pneumonia at Fort Knox had been vicious. One morning, the sheer weakness had pinned me to my bunk, a high fever making my thoughts swim in a hazy delirium. The sight of pink foam bubbling up with each cough was the first truly alarming sign. When I missed formation, the drill sergeant, usually a figure of intimidating authority, had found me, his expression momentarily softening to concern. A medic was called, and soon I was being whisked away in an ambulance to the base hospital. 3 nights I spent there, the routine a blur of IV fluids and daily X-rays. I remember those X-rays vividly, particularly the last one. The radiological technician, a grim set to his jar, had pointed to the film. "Both lungs involved," he'd murmured. I saw it myself, a bewildering pattern of small nodes connected by faint, almost spiderweb-like lines. Despite the severity, they released me back to my unit. I somehow managed to graduate with my class, a walking testament to sheer stubbornness, though still very ill. The decision to drive home for a few weeks before the fall intake at the Military Institute was born of necessity, a desperate hope for recovery. But the long hours on the road took their toll. Each mile felt like a siphon, drawing away what little strength I had left. By the time I finally arrived at the school 2 weeks before classes began, the familiar, unwelcome symptoms were back with a vengeance. A soaring fever and the chilling return of that pink sputum. After the brief perfunctory assignment to my room and a quick word with my tactical officer, it was clear my place was not in a dorm, but back in the infirmary.
There were no grand premonitions, no sudden flashes of insight that this day would be different. Only a dull, aching throb behind my eyes and the persistent, gnawing weakness that had become my normal. The doctor's visit to my infirmary room that afternoon was brief, almost perfunctory. He prescribed antibiotics and Lomotil, a drug intended to control the severe diarrhea. What neither of us knew, what I wouldn't discover until much later, was that I was hypersensitive to atropine, one of the active ingredients in the Lomotil. There was no internal alarm bell, no unsettling intuition, just the weary hope that these new medications would finally turn the tide. I took the pills, the metallic taste lingering on my tongue, and drifted into a fitful sleep, the hum of the IV pump a quiet lullaby. The true shift began when I woke. It was nighttime. The room was cast in shadows, illuminated only by the faint glow from the hallway. And then it hit me, a jolt of pure, unadulterated wrongness. My heart wasn't just beating, it was a frantic drum solo against my ribs, racing at an unterrifying, impossible pace. My mouth felt like sandpaper, utterly parched, and the room spun around me with a dizzying, sickening vertigo. This wasn't just illness, this was something entirely new, something terrifyingly unfamiliar. I had never felt this way before, nor have I since. A cold, creeping realization began to dawn. I was in serious trouble. My body was failing, unraveling at an alarming speed. I fumbled for the call button, my hand trembling, pushing it repeatedly, but there was no response. The silence from the nurse's station was deafening, amplified by the frantic thumping in my chest. I tried to yell, my throat raw and dry, but the words were weak, swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the infirmary. Desperation, cold and sharp, spurred me. I had to get help. With monumental effort, I managed to roll myself out of bed, collapsing onto the cool linoleum floor. The IV stand clattered beside me, its wheels protesting as I dragged it along. On hands and knees, a pathetic crawl, I started across the room towards the dim light of the nurse's station, a beacon of hope in the deepening gloom. Each inch was an agonizing effort, my muscles screaming in protest, my vision blurring at the edges. I remember finally reaching the counter, pulling myself up, one hand finding purchase, fighting to haul my failing body higher. And then, a flurry of movement. The single night nurse, startled, ran around the counter. Her voice was a blur of concerned questions, her face a mask of alarm, as she gently but firmly eased me back onto the floor. She left, then returned with a male attendant, their faces grim, their movements urgent. A gurney appeared, and I felt myself being lifted, gently, onto its cold, unyielding surface. They wheeled me into a room directly across from the nurse's station, a room with a large window looking out onto the silent hallway. My consciousness was fraying, fading in and out, the world becoming a tapestry of dim lights and indistinct shapes. I think they were hooking me up to another IV. That's the last thing I remember before the true descent began.
Then a completely different viewpoint. I was watching from below the ceiling, calm, curious, observing my own body as they fought for a life that, from that vantage point, felt strangely detached. If this was death, I remember thinking, it wasn't so bad at all. The last sensation I recall from my body on that gurney was a fading consciousness, a sensation of light and shadow dancing at the edges of my vision. There was no grand crescendo of pain or fear, just a slow, almost imperceptible dimming, like a faulty light bulb flickering before finally extinguishing. The weight of my own body, the crushing fatigue that had plagued me for weeks, simply dissolved. It wasn't a violent separation, but a gentle, effortless unmooring. One moment I was fading on the gurney, the next I was simply there, suspended. And then the vision. It wasn't a dream, not a hallucination, but an intensely vivid and undeniably real shift in perspective. I was no longer in my body, but observing it from above. My viewpoint was perhaps 3 feet behind my left shoulder, subtly elevated, giving me a perfect panoramic view of the entire room. There was no tunnel vision, no blurry edges, only extreme clarity. My vision, normally a frustrating 2400 without corrective lenses, was now piercingly sharp, every detail rendered with an almost hyper-real precision. I could see everything: the sterile white walls, the medical equipment, the small window across from the nurse's station, and most strikingly, my own inert form lying on the gurney below. The scene unfolding beneath me was one of frantic urgency, yet I felt utterly calm. A male attendant was performing CPR on my chest, his movements strong and rhythmic, while another male attendant was bagging me, a steady, deliberate squeeze of the resuscitation bag. The female nurse, the one who had found me crawling, was leaving the room, her expression a mix of distress and purpose. Then a new figure entered, a person in a blue jacket, radiating an aura of calm authority. He seemed to take charge instantly, his presence commanding even from my elevated vantage point. CPR continued, a relentless, desperate dance to reclaim a life that I was now observing as if it were a distant play. The overwhelming emotion in this state was one of profound, unshakable calm. Fear, that primal human instinct, was utterly absent. There was no panic, no anxiety, only a mild, almost academic curiosity about the scene below. This isn't so bad, I remember thinking, a thought that resonated with a quiet certainty, if this is death. Time itself seemed to lose all meaning. There was no urgency, no sense of a ticking clock. I simply was, an observer, floating effortlessly, detached from the physical drama below. My sense of self, my identity as me, remained perfectly intact, only now I was unbound, unattached to the physical world, a pure point of consciousness. There were no other beings, no brilliant lights, no tunnels, no sweeping panoramas of my past life. Just me, observing the efforts of those trying to resuscitate the body I had seemingly left behind. The feeling of lightness and freedom was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The oppressive weight of my physical body, the persistent aches and weakness were gone. I was weightless, unburdened, capable of effortless, unbound movement if I chose. It was an absolute contrast to my earthly existence, where every breath had been a struggle, every movement an effort against the drag of illness. This freedom was not just physical, it was a profound liberation of spirit, a sense of absolute tranquility that permeated my very being. The external world, with its frantic efforts to revive my body, seemed distant, almost muted, though I could hear their voices and the rhythmic sounds of their work with perfect clarity.
In this expanded state of awareness, my perception felt heightened, not in terms of loudness or brightness, but in an almost intuitive sense of knowing. I didn't actively process thoughts at a rapid pace. Rather, understanding simply was. The scene below me, the mechanics of CPR, the roles of each person, all unfolded with an innate clarity. There was no confusion, no questioning of what I was witnessing. It was a pure, unadulterated observation. It was as if my consciousness had expanded beyond the narrow confines of my skull, granting me a broader, more encompassing field of view, and a deeper, more immediate understanding of the unfolding reality. This was not a realm populated by specific entities or voices, no divine pronouncements, no reunion with departed loved ones. My experience was solitary, a pure confrontation with the raw state of being beyond the physical. There was no telepathic communication, no detailed life review, no visions of future or past. What I gained, instead,
was a direct, visceral understanding of death's true nature. It was not a terrifying void, but a state of profound peace. The fear of it, a subtle undercurrent in human consciousness, simply vanished. It was an experiential knowing, not an intellectual one. I didn't think death was peaceful. I felt its absolute tranquility. This was the core revelation, an elemental truth absorbed without words or complex imagery. It was a powerful, undeniable feeling that everything would be all right, regardless of the outcome on the gurney below. My pre-existing beliefs, or lack thereof, were utterly irrelevant in this state. The reality of the experience transcended any prior skepticism or casual acceptance of religious dogma. It was an entirely new data set, information received not through scripture or sermon, but through direct, conscious existence outside the usual parameters. I didn't suddenly understand the meaning of life or the universe or my specific purpose. There was no grand cosmic revelation or a sudden grasp of universal connection. It was simpler, yet infinitely more profound for me. A direct, undeniable confirmation that consciousness persists beyond the body, and that the cessation of physical life is met not with pain or terror, but with an incredible, pervasive calm. This understanding wasn't something I sought. It was simply presented to me, an undeniable truth etched onto the fabric of my altered consciousness. I floated there, an unattached observer, for a period I cannot precisely quantify. Minutes? An eternity? In that state, such measurements held no meaning. The intensity of the calmness was absolute, a state almost impossible to articulate in earthly terms. It was a complete absence of struggle, a surrender to a state of being that felt utterly natural, more natural perhaps than the frantic, breathless struggle of earthly life. It was a revelation of inherent peace, a quiet assurance that transcended all logic and reason.
Waking up back on that gurney was a jarring intrusion, a sudden, unwelcome plummet from boundless peace into the familiar prison of a failing body. The doctor's words echoed, "You're lucky to be alive," a stark contrast to the effortless calm I'd just known. The return was not a gentle drift back into consciousness, but a jarring, almost violent snap. One moment I was floating, utterly serene, an unburdened observer. The next, I was back, slammed into the confines of my physical form with a sickening jolt. The lightness and freedom that had been my reality were brutally replaced by an overwhelming sense of gravity and immense weakness. My body felt impossibly heavy, a leaden weight pinned to the gurney. The air which had been so effortlessly breathable in that detached state now felt thick and heavy, each breath a conscious, painful effort. There was no immediate surge of pain, but a profound, almost dizzying disorientation, a crushing awareness of the physical discomfort that had been absent moments before. It was a shock, a profound sensory assault, as if someone had abruptly thrown a heavy blanket over a brightly lit world. My first thought was a confused, almost indignant, "I'm back?" It wasn't relief, not joy, but a deep, pervasive disappointment. The absolute peace, the effortless calm, the boundless detachment, it was all gone, replaced by the mundane, aching reality of my illness. I felt a keen sense of loss, as if a precious, profound secret had been snatched away. How could I be back here, in this painful, limited body, after experiencing such an expansive, tranquil existence? The contrast was stark, almost unbearable. My mind, still swimming in the afterglow of that impossible calm, struggled to reconcile the two realities. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? But the memory of looking down, seeing my own body, was too vivid, too undeniably real to dismiss. My physical state was abysmal. Every muscle felt like jelly, a profound weakness that permeated every fiber of my being. My throat was raw, likely from the intubation during the resuscitation, and my chest ached from the CPR. My vision, now back to its normal blurry state, struggled to focus on the indistinct shapes around me. I felt a lingering nausea, a profound fatigue that seeped into my bones. The rhythmic beep of a monitor was now a constant, intrusive presence, a stark reminder of my precarious hold on life. An IV was still in my arm, delivering fluids and presumably medications that were now carefully chosen.
The first face I truly registered was the man in the blue jacket. He was no longer just an authority figure in my out-of-body observation. He was a doctor, standing over me, his expression serious but relieved. The female nurse, possibly the same one, was also there, her movements less frantic now. The doctor spoke, his words cutting through the lingering haze of my experience. "You had a serious reaction to a medication, probably the Lomotil." He paused, his gaze direct. "You're lucky to be alive." Lucky. The word hung in the air. A paradox. Lucky to be pulled back to this aching body, this limited reality, when I had just tasted something so profoundly peaceful. It felt strange, almost ironic. They explained it as a hypersensitive reaction, rather than an allergic one, a subtle medical distinction that held little meaning to me at the time. Their faces registered a mix of relief and a certain professional satisfaction, the quiet triumph of a life saved. But there was also a subtle undercurrent of something else, a quiet wonder, perhaps, at how close I had come. In those immediate hours and days, I didn't rush to share what had happened. How could I? How could I articulate the feeling of watching my own lifeless body, the profound calm, the absence of fear, the inexplicable clarity of vision? The language simply didn't exist in my world to convey such a paradox. I instinctively knew that these experiences, this radical shift in perspective, would likely be met with skepticism, perhaps even concern for my mental state. It was too far outside the accepted reality. So I kept it to myself, a profound, secret truth nestled deep within my consciousness. The immediate focus was on my physical recovery, which was still a slow, painful re-entry into the physical.
That experience gave me an undeniable truth. Death is not a fearful end, but a peaceful transition. It changed the very fabric of my understanding, not with grand revelations about the universe, but with the quiet, profound comfort of knowing that beyond the veil of life there is an absolute calm. Emerging from the infirmary 5 days later, still terribly weak, was not just a physical transition. It was a profound re-entry into a world that now felt subtly, yet irrevocably different. The pervasive cough was a constant, raw reminder of the body's fragility, but my internal landscape had been redrawn. I made the pragmatic decision to forego that school year, a decision born not of defeat, but of a newly acquired understanding of my body's limits and the need for true recovery. I drove home, a journey of physical exhaustion, but also quiet contemplation. Over the next 6 months, as my body slowly mended, my mind continued to process the impossible. The changes in my life weren't immediately dramatic or outwardly visible. I didn't suddenly abandon all my former ambitions or embrace an entirely new lifestyle. My core nature, that pragmatic, somewhat stoic individual, remained. Yet beneath the surface, a quiet metamorphosis was underway. My priorities began to subtly shift. The relentless pursuit of external validation, the rigid adherence to a predetermined path, started to lose some of its sharp edges. I found myself less concerned with the minutiae of military discipline and more attuned to the simple rhythms of life. The quiet beauty in a sunset, the comforting presence of family. I didn't abandon my interest in structure or logic, but I gained a newfound appreciation for the ephemeral, for the unquantifiable aspects of existence. What I had perhaps taken for granted before, the simple act of breathing without struggle, the ability to walk without pain, now felt like profound gifts. The mundane aspects of daily life, once just routine, held a new, fragile preciousness. I started valuing presence over progress, being over doing in a way I never had before. The most profound impact of my near-death experience was on my worldview, particularly my understanding of life and death. Prior to that day, death was an abstract concept, a distant biological inevitability. My lapsed Catholic faith offered some framework, but it was largely theoretical, not deeply felt. After the experience, however, there was no room for abstract thought or theoretical belief. I had experienced it directly. The single, most potent truth I carried back was that death is peaceful. There was no brilliant light, no ethereal beings, no grand cosmic understanding of God or the universe's purpose. It was simpler, yet infinitely more powerful. The cessation of physical life is met not with agony or terror, but with an incredible, pervasive calm. This wasn't a belief I adopted, it was a knowledge I had acquired, an undeniable truth etched into my very being.
This new understanding didn't transform me into a spiritual guru or an evangelist. I didn't suddenly find God in a conventional sense, nor did my religious practices change. I still lean towards Catholicism, largely out of tradition and early exposure, but my personal philosophy now includes an experiential layer that transcends dogma. The fear of death, which I now realize was an unconscious undercurrent in my pre-experience life, simply evaporated. It was replaced by a quiet acceptance, a profound comfort. Life became less about avoiding death and more about experiencing the present moment, understanding that the transition, when it comes, is not to be feared. The notion of consciousness existing independently of the body, once a theoretical concept, became a lived reality. This was my revelation, a quiet, unshakable certainty that my awareness, myself, persists even when the body falters. Integrating this profound, inexplicable experience back into normal life wasn't without its challenges. The primary difficulty was the sheer incommunicability of it. How do you describe the intensity of calmness to someone who has never felt it? How do you explain looking down at your own body while feeling utterly detached and serene? I kept it to myself for years, knowing that such a story would likely be met with disbelief, skepticism, or even concern for my mental state. There was no framework in our collective understanding, no common language to truly share what I had witnessed. This led to a subtle sense of isolation, a private truth that separated me from those around me. There was no dramatic existential crisis, just a quiet process of reconciling two vastly different realities, the intense physical world and the boundless peaceful realm I had briefly visited. I went back to the Military Institute in 1981, attended for a year and a half, but eventually decided it wasn't for me, a decision influenced by a constellation of factors, not least of which was the altered perspective I now carried. My purpose didn't become about spreading this knowledge. It became about living with it, quietly, profoundly, letting it inform my choices without needing external validation. My journey through that brief cessation of life left me with one undeniable, powerful message. Death is peaceful.
It is not the terrifying void, not the agonizing end, but a state of absolute calm and quiet observation. I carry this knowledge not as a burden, but as a source of profound peace. It doesn't mean I seek death, or that I don't cherish life. On the contrary, understanding the gentle nature of that transition has allowed me to live with a deeper appreciation for every moment, free from the shadow of fear that once unknowingly colored my existence. My story isn't one of grand visions or divine encounters, but of a quiet, personal revelation, that consciousness continues and that the ultimate journey is one of peace. May this understanding offer you, too, a sense of hope, a gentle comfort in the face of life's most profound mystery.
Gregory's journey offers such a powerful and comforting perspective on what lies beyond our physical lives. It's truly remarkable how his experience shifted his entire understanding of death from an abstract fear to a profound sense of peace. If Gregory's story resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more incredible accounts. And for our discussion question related to Gregory's experience, what was the most surprising or impactful detail for you in Gregory's near-death experience? And how does it challenge or confirm your own beliefs about life and death? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and I hope Gregory's message of peace brings you some comfort today.